Hey guys, my name is Cris Urzua and I want to welcome you to the Cris Urzua podcast. In this, our fourth episode, we have Darren Weeks. Who is Darren Weeks? He is a Canadian business owner, investor, and expert when it comes to raising capital. He owned the Fast Track company in Canada since 2001 with recognition in the profit list as one of the companies with the best growth for 3 consecutive years. He has purchased over 5,000 properties. He has raised over $500 million in investments, and he's the author of the bestseller, The Art of Raising Capital, and co-author with Robert Kiyosaki. This is an incredible interview where we talked a lot about business, entrepreneurship, investing, and common mistakes that people do along the way, and I hope that you really enjoy it. With that said, welcome to the Cris Urzua podcast. Mr. Darren Weeks, nice to see you, man. How's everything going?
Going very well. Good to see you as well. It's been a while.
It's been a while, dude, and I'm glad to have you here in the podcast. Thank you for your time, and I want to get right to it. I have one question, and my main question to kickstart this conversation is, what is your definition of money?
That's an interesting question. In fact, last night I was sitting with my niece, and she's 19 and her boyfriend's 20, and we were talking about the best investment. And I said to them, well, it's education. And they were like saying, well, no, like real estate, like business, should we do crypto? And I said, no, like literally you need to get some financial education. And one of my mentors for many years was Robert Kiyosaki. I guess he still is. And his slogan many years ago was knowledge is money. So to me, money is knowledge. And how do you get that knowledge? You need to study financial education. And that's a huge differentiation between people, I think, that have money or people that do not have money. They just don't have the education. They don't have the context, the belief system. So I'm a big proponent of education.
I love it, man. And it comes to mind that when the pandemic hit, I don't know if you remember that I called you. And I was in a situation where I had 70 employees. I had just refurnished these huge offices. I had this credit line with an advertising company that was very big. And I remember that I asked you for advice, and I was like, hey, I'm in this situation. What would you do? Because I had lost 50% of my company. And I remember that the advice that you gave me was, Chris, just make sure that you take care of yourself, that you don't play the hero, because in entrepreneurship,
Right.
you can't be a hero. And it's funny enough, because that was the right advice. That was like the perfect advice, and I didn't follow it.
Okay. You didn't.
No, I didn't. That was a hard thing because I was very emotionally involved with my team, and it was
Sure.
my family, and I didn't want to fire people
Totally
very
understand.
quick. And I'm telling you this story because I was a very bad student of yours, but also because we're segueing into knowledge, right? And there's certain types of knowledges that you can read, like textbook and go to a conference, and other things that you can you need to live through them usually, right? And what would you say are things in entrepreneurship and business building and investing that are the hardest to learn? Like, you can buy the course, you can buy everything, you'll be exposed to it, but are there any type of things that you go like, oh, this is like hard for people to grasp at the first time they hear it?
I think everything, like even last night when I was talking to my niece, now they're young, but they want to buy properties. And I kind of went over, okay, how are you going to buy properties? Well, we need, in Lethbridge, Alberta, they need about $60,000 to buy one property. So they said, well, we're going to save up money. And it's going to take us 6 years. I said, well, why don't you just do it with somebody else's money? And again, a completely foreign concept to them. They never, ever thought about it. It doesn't cross their consciousness. So, a mentor is important. And let's say that you and I would have talked a lot more often and we were closer. We've done business together and we've done some events together and whatnot. Maybe you would have taken my advice and listened. But, what can you do besides have experiences on your own? I'm not sure if there's an answer. You have to experience things on your own. But maybe if we were a little closer and it took more time to explain it, or let's say we talked each day or every couple of days, maybe you would have changed some things to make it quicker. Because that's what happened to me back in 2012. I had 13 offices, 100 employees, and it was the exact same in my mindset as well. When the government changed all the regulations to shut down the ability to raise capital in Alberta, Canada, I didn't want to be the bad person. I didn't want to let everybody else. I thought I could solve the problem. So when the pandemic hit, that was the advice I gave you, just based on, losing $5 million just in cash, never mind opportunity cost. So when the pandemic happened, I also have a wine company. I'm just the investor. And my partner wanted to, do the same thing, go slow, don't lay anybody off. And I said, no, we're laying up people off tomorrow. And it was the best decision we ever had. Our sales went up and our employee costs went way down. Wine business, people still want to drink.
Yeah, it makes
So
a lot of sense.
I don't know what to say, Chris. Like, you got to go through some experiences on your own, but maybe if we're closer, maybe we'll listen more. I don't know.
Yeah, of course. And that's the power of a mentor is saving time at the end of the day, right?
Sure.
Of making sure that you can learn from other people's experiences. And there's a Warren Buffett quote that I like, or it's at least credited to him, that is, what we learn from history is that people do not usually learn from history, right? And having the capacity of learning from other people's experiences and not getting emotionally involved and being able to make like accurate decisions when you need to make them is so important. Now, Darren, one of the things that I wanted to ask you is, I know that a lot of people that listen to us might be either aspiring entrepreneurs, or entrepreneurs that are kind of like starting, or maybe investors that are kind of looking at their first opportunities. What are the key skills you need in order to create wealth?
Well, many years ago, I had an event. I used to do a lot of seminars all over the world, but primarily in Canada. And we had groups of 6, is what I always do, round tables of 6, so people could discuss things and whatnot. And I had each group actually come up with the top skills necessary to be an entrepreneur. And at the end of the day, there were many skills that every table basically had mentioned, a lot of repetition. But really what I found at the end of the day, what we all agreed on is you need a lot of skills. There's not one that's more important than another. It's a system of systems. It's like your body. What's more important, your brain or your heart, your kidneys or your liver? So you really need them all. My weakness, and it has been for many years, is say social media, technology. It's one of my weaknesses. My strength is sales. But you have to have organizational skills. You have to have accounting skills, financial skills, the interpersonal skills. The list goes on and on. So what I've always suggested to people is, if you're always working on your skills, that's something the government cannot take away from you at the next pandemic, for instance, or the next recession. And I would argue that if another pandemic happened, or a bad recession, like the financial crash in 2008, people that have the skills are always going to survive. In every market in history, whenever something crashed, people still survived. Some people still thrived. And I would argue those people that have the skills necessary will thrive. So if tomorrow, we start using chicken eggs for currency, Chris and I are going to still have more chicken eggs than most people, because we have the skills. And, you can Google what skills you need to be an entrepreneur, but there's a lot of them, but I don't think there's like one you can say is more important than another. Everything. You need to know a whole bunch of little things. And then if you don't want to be really skillful in a certain area, obviously you have to hire that person so they can be the social media expert, for instance, which I don't do. So you got to be multifaceted when it comes to skills. Work on all your skills continuously, and that's something that nobody can ever take away from you. You can't get fired and lose your skills. Government can't take it away. So work on the skills necessary as an entrepreneur, and there's many of them.
And it's interesting because I feel that an accurate metaphor for entrepreneurship is usually the gym. And that's not very sexy, right? If you're going to get good at hiring, you have to hire a lot of people. If you want to get good at sales, you have to do a lot of sales presentations. If you want to get good at lead generation, you have to invest a lot of money. You have to test different methods, right? And it's just persistency. And it's funny because a lot of times people will see case studies or the typical one-hit wonder that they do one strategy the first time, they make a lot of money. And then people think that it is that way for everybody. And it's not usually that way. And I wanted to ask you about your strength, about sales. Every good salesperson that I had like not an epiphany, but like a moment where they had to pay their dues and do a lot of sales calls, a lot of, for me, it was 8 years in the timeshare industry, just meeting like 4 couples a day and just selling timeshare in Westin or in Marriott. What was it for you? Where did you get your reps when it came to sales?
Well, when I quit my job, I had a perfectly good job, my dad says. He just shook his head when I said, Dad, I'm going to quit. I'm going to do real estate full time. I didn't know how to raise capital. This is many years ago. And I took accounting in school, so I was not an extrovert. I didn't like to, even public speak at all in small groups. But I realized really quickly that if I wanted to succeed, I had to do things that were uncomfortable. And a friend of mine introduced a sales concept called Sandler Sales. It's a franchise, Sandler Sales. And the course was $1,800. And I swallowed really hard when he said that because I didn't have a job. I didn't have much money, but he swore this course was the best thing he's ever taken in 20 years in sales. So I said, okay, I'll do it. And we would go to course, say on I don't remember, Monday morning from 7 till 9. And then the next week he'd come back and it was like maybe 12 weeks of this course. So then I would go back to my office and I would implement what I learned. And I'll never forget, I've told the story a few times, like the very first time I phoned this one lady who I met at a teacher convention, because I used to go to teacher conventions to meet people to then invest with me in real estate. Because they had a job and some of them obviously would have a house that was paid off or whatever, and they probably didn't want to buy real estate on their own. So that was my shtick. And I remember practicing what I learned in that sales course, and it worked. No, I didn't sell a condo that day, but she goes, wow, because my philosophy was, Cris, obviously we met last week at the teacher convention and you gave me your phone number because you're interested in discussing my real estate program with your husband. I just wanted to let you know I'm not a professional sales person. I took accounting at university a couple of years ago. And if we do meet, I'm never going to pressure you. You can always say no if you want to. And she said these words, exactly these words. She goes, wow, that's so refreshing to hear that. So for me, it was like, okay, I learned something that morning and it worked that night. So I just kept, listening to that course. But as far as reps go, really, I didn't have as many years experience with you and doing presentations. When I started my seminar company, I hired people to do all that, but I knew enough to be dangerous. So I taught the Sandler sales system and I hired somebody to teach all my reps. So we had hundreds of reps over the years, as well as Blair Singer. He's a good mentor of mine with Rich Dad. But those two concepts together, we utilized, and we were one of the fastest growing companies. But I will say this again, I still know Sandler and I still know how to do it, but I don't do it. Of my 5,000 investors, I didn't talk to one of them. I didn't sign a deal with it. Not one of them. I had other people do it. But I know in the back of my mind, BS when my salespeople tell me BS. Does that make sense?
Yeah, of course. And that's
so
also
not a lot of reps, but it was like, sorry to interrupt, but not a lot of reps because it was my money. I took it serious, man. Like I took it serious. It was a lot of money. And when it worked, it just made me more confident.
I love it. And that's another skill. That's leadership as well. And I wanted to ask you, when handling people and handling teams, do you believe in intuition? Or let's say when you're talking to your team and you're like looking for clues and maybe you doubt somebody that he's being legit about what he's done or how the deal worked out, what do you rely on as a leader to actually spot and judge people if they're actually telling you the truth or if they're cutting corners, you're not getting the whole scenario?
Yeah, I like to do something called a debrief. And I need to do more of it. But for instance, if I have a call with my reps, I have some Mexican reps now, and let's say they met you, Cris, and then for whatever reason, you said no. So then I want to ask them, I want to go through, we have a checklist, like a 13-point checklist. So, okay, tell me what you said on our financial aspect. Tell me how you did the upfront contract. And I make them walk through every single one of them. And 99.9% of the time, they forgot something or didn't do it. Almost every time. It's amazing. So I guess I would say it's logic. It's just go through that system. And if you can't do what we've trained in person with me with no stress, then you didn't do it with the customer. And that's why you didn't have the customer buy or invest, for instance, because you didn't do the steps. You're not professional. You're taking shortcuts. I do logic.
When I started doing online sales calls many years ago, I used to have like a printed step-by-step of like the 8 steps of the sales call. And I practiced like people not looking at my eyes, like moving from the camera so I could be as fluent as possible. And I love that your approach is very tactical. It's just logic and steps and making sure that we have a process. Now, I wanted to ask you, reading a little bit about you, I heard that one of the most interesting like raising capital deals that you did was raising capital to build ports for cruise ships in a certain place. Was it in the Caribbean?
We did 2. We did one in Honduras and one in Jamaica.
Good. How were you approached for that opportunity? That's a huge deal. How much capital did you have to raise for that?
That one was about almost 11 million US. And I would say when you become good at raising capital, you never have to worry about deal flow. And deal flow is, if you're asking yourself, okay, when's the last time I was shown a really good opportunity? And if the answer is like, I haven't been shown a good opportunity for a long time, you don't have enough deal flow. So when you're good at raising capital, the phone rings off the hook, because everybody needs equity, which is typically what I would refer to as your down payment. And then you want to get bank financing after that. So it's interesting because the deal we did was with the Royal Caribbean Cruise Line. They're a $10 billion company, and I've been having quarterly meetings ever since 2010 when we completed that deal. We still own the port. But they called us, Royal Caribbean called us, because we did a smaller port in Honduras. And with the financial crisis back in 2008, 9, 10, even large billion-dollar companies were having troubles with bank financing. So they phoned us. We're relatively small company in Canada. They had all the executives come up to Canada. Their lawyers, they saw the seminars we did. They saw the approach that we had with our investors. And it took about a year of them doing their due diligence and research. And we finally did the deal. And I think at the time maybe it still is the largest cruise ship terminal in the world.
Incredible. And what lesson did you get out of that deal? Like in that whole process of, it's funny to believe that billion-dollar companies can have such a hard time raising capital. And I don't know, what did you learn, one lesson out of doing that whole thing?
There's so many. I would have structured the deal differently. You've had to do it all over again. But on the other hand, they're kind of the bigger fish, and they had an upper hand to some degree. And I've got to be careful with what I say because it's still an active deal. But there's a few things I would have changed with the specifics of the deal. And my mistake was I let my CEO do that. And I shouldn't have. I should have been more involved with the actual specifics on how the deal worked. That'd be the biggest mistake, I think, in that deal.
Okay. Now, Darren, you're an expert when it comes to raising capital. And all over the U.S., Latin America, as you mentioned, like everybody wants to raise capital for something, whether it's a startup idea or an investment plan, etc. When it comes to entrepreneurs, to business owners that want to raise capital, there's usually two paths of entrepreneurs. We have like the more Silicon Valley structure, like round A or round B, and then we have like the small business owner, right? To the entrepreneurs that are listening to us in both scenarios, what would be your best advice when it comes to building a plan to raise capital to make their companies go faster?
Well, I'm definitely more of the B scenario. Like, I'm not the Silicon Valley where, you have a great idea and people are flocking to you and throwing money at you. I'm a retail investor, raising capital guy. The average investor in Canada, I think, invested with me per deal was about $17,000. So I had 5,000 people invest in multiple projects. Okay. We bought 5,000 apartment units, some cruise ship terminals, et cetera. But the number one reason I see people failing in raising capital is they don't ask anybody. And I'm not kidding. I can say to a room of 100 people, how many people would use an extra $1 million to grow their business? And all the hands go up. Then I say, okay, now put up your hands and all your fingers and tell me in the last month, how many people have you asked to, partner with you, invest with you? And the answer is always zero. It's just not in our mindsets. Wow. And even last night, my niece and her boyfriend is like, "What? What do you mean ask people?" I said, "Yeah, there's way more people out there, like teachers, or than I went to dentists when I was younger. There's way more people that have money than ask for money by probably 1,000 to 1. It's not difficult. It's just most people don't ask."
That's an interesting fact. And I guess that a lot of people do not know what to do with the money. And this brings me to another story. In one of your events, remember that I went to Cabo. You hosted like a Shark Tank style contest, and we had to give a pitch, and I participated, and I won the 100K investment from you. And I remember that one of the conversations that we had around the table of the guys that we were attending the event, a lot of people did not know what they would do with that money. And they were business owners, and some of them like selling 7 figures a year. And it was just like, what the heck would I do with that money? Where would I put it? And usually when you are looking at businesses that want to raise capital, what's the smartest thing they can invest it in? Is it usually like hard assets that are really backed up, or is it in ad spend, or is it in what do you think is like a nice plan? I want to give ideas to people listening to us. Like, hey, you want to raise capital? You need to invest that capital that you raised in this and this and this, just so you don't end up screwing it up.
Well, everyone is different, obviously, but before you raise the capital, you should have a pro forma and a plan, which you would then show your investor and say, this is what I'm going to do with the money. Because you have to be cognizant of the fact that when you raise other people's money, that's their blood, sweat, and tears. And you have to pay that money back, plus you have to give them a profit. So raising money, I guess it's the hard part to some degree, but no, it's not really. The hard part is then to make sure that money is deployed. So you're going to grow it, give them the money back, good return. So every business would be different, but what I primarily focus on now is I lend money to people that have a real estate business, and then they buy either land or they buy houses to refurbish, because I want to make sure I have collateral. I want something I can take if they don't pay me. And I like the real estate business side because I understand it. So for me, it's pretty easy. I know what to look for now. I stick to real estate that produces cash flow, and I want to own either the land or buildings or both.
And when it comes to real estate, what would you say is a market that has the most opportunities right now? Mexico, the US, or Canada, or the three of them, and you just need to know what to look for?
Well, I can never blanket say that Mexico is better than Canada or US is better than this area. What you have to really study is the fundamentals in every single market. So if you're in Dallas, for instance, your fundamentals are going to be different than they're going to be in Phoenix or New York or Cabo San Lucas or Cancun or Edmonton. So you really have to micro focus on every area you're going to look at. And even within countries, there's better states or provinces than others because of the economics of that area. Affordability, in-migration, job creation. So there's something called the real estate S-curve, and you can Google that probably. The real estate S-curve also shows you that real estate markets typically go in cycles. So they're going to go up for 7 to 10 years. They're going to correct a little bit, not all the way back down, but correct a little bit. And then they're going to be flat for 7 to 10 years. Now, Chris, you're familiar with Cabo. When I moved there in 2018, it had been flat for 7 or 8 years since the crash of 2008, 9, 10. But now it's gone up for the last 4 years. So again, cycles come and go. And the way you can predict those is by studying the fundamentals, which is basically the job creation in those areas.
That's interesting. There's a book that I based a lot of what I teach in business, and it's called Jumping the S-Curve. And it actually refers to the S-Curve in a very similar manner, but catered towards businesses. And maybe we're talking about the same thing, that every business, whether it's bootstrapped or it has capital behind it, lives in this recurring 7 to 10 year cycle that just repeats itself, where you go from like idea to traction, momentum, flatline, and then either the breakthrough or the breakdown. I guess it's exactly the same thing because real estate is a business, right?
That's a key fact too, and a lot of people don't think that it's a business. So, referring again to my niece last night, and I said, okay, if you want to raise money, guess what? You have to have a website, just like every other business. You have to have business cards. You have to be professional. You have to have trade show banners. You're a business.
Love it.
But most people don't treat it that way.
Let's take it back to entrepreneurs trying to raise capital for their business. You mentioned that you need to have a pro forma, you need to have a plan. That, of course, the people think that the hardest part is to actually raise a capital, but the hardest part is actually to make the capital work and give the profits back in time and in promised. Right now, in the ecosystem of people that would invest in businesses, what would a sexy offer look like? And we're talking about small businesses. I know, of course, like $1 billion deal would be very sexy, but when it comes to a smaller company, if they wanted to structure something when they could approach somebody and go like, hey, you invest 10K, 20K in my business, I'm looking for 10 people and you'll get this amount of money back in X time frame. Do you have anything that would give people an idea of what would make a deal sexy or attractive?
Well, that's a great question. And here's what could save a lot of you a lot of money. So for instance, we had some people in my seminars in Canada in a place called Fort McMurray. And we used to call it Fort McMoney because it's got so much oil and gas and whatnot. There's so much resources. So everybody who got into real estate, they thought they were, Ken McElroy, who's a rich dad advisor. They thought they were geniuses because the market was just going up. They weren't doing anything special. The market was just going up. And they were paying their investors like crazy returns, 40, 50, 60% returns. And I said to them, I would never, ever show a pro forma to my investor, I would say to you, Chris, and say, okay, here's how it's going to work. We're going to make all this money and you're going to get a 50% return. What I used to do to dentists when I used to go to dentist conventions, as I got to meet them and they're walking by my booth or they come to my golf trade show, I would say, Chris, what kind of returns would you be happy with? And Chris, I've asked hundreds of dentists, never once did anybody ever say more than 10%. The odd person that said 10, I said, are you getting 10 or that's what you'd like? And most times they go, actually, yeah, I'm not getting 10, but I'd like 10. So my point is, it depends on how your offer is, and I'll get back to that in a minute, but I would ask the customer what they want. Because if they say 6%, then why would you want to offer them 50? And that was a huge mistake these people up in Fort McMurray were doing. It's like, you're giving away, you don't need to. If the investor's happy with 10, then give them 10.
That's
now,
a really
when we did our
question.
deals, it's really powerful. When we did our deals, because we had offering memorandums, we had to have everything consistent. But if you have, smaller investors and you have smaller amounts of money you're raising, you can customize each opportunity. Chris might want to be in for 5 years, and somebody else might want to be in for 3. So you can, let's say they ever talk, you can always say, well, hey, I asked you what you wanted, and I give you a different term and a higher rate than the other person or whatever. But ask them. And here's the other worry. If you say to somebody, because your business is growing and you can give them 25% return, Chris, if you meet somebody who's not necessarily sophisticated and you say, I'm going to show you a 25% return, what do you think they think in their mind?
20 risk.
Bingo. Now, for you and I, we think, okay, maybe that's low, but for most people, the 10% is a magic number. Anything over 10, they're starting to think that must be very risky. Because that's one of the concepts we're taught from, being a little person, a kid, is, high returns mean high risk. Now, I don't believe that, but 99% of the population does. So if you start pitching something with a 25% return, even though it could be very valid, their context isn't ready for it.
I love that question. I always laugh that I tell people that the question that has made me the most money in many, many years has always been, hey, is that the best price you can give me? And people laugh, right? Because it's literally bargaining, right?
Sure.
But that question is one of those questions that just learning it and making sure that you are not acting as a robot and that you understand that your ideal client has a different mind frame as you and they reference to other things and how most people will actually look at the bank. Like, what does the bank give me per year? And not a lot of people will be into really risky things. I love it. I love that. That's a great tip. And you were talking about the market, right? Like the city in Canada where everybody was making money. And a couple of years back in the digital education industry, the Latin players that we were at this industry, we were selling and we were all kind of looking for that $1 million launch strategy, right? And it was a couple of years, like maybe 6 years, where you had really big players in Latin America doing a lot of money, but we just couldn't get to that point where in less than 3 to 5 days, we made $1 million in sales, right? And I remember that I was kind of like mentally in competition with a couple of buddies of mine of who was going to be the first Latin American guy to do that. And all of a sudden, a guy in Spain that came out of nowhere, like really nobody knew this guy, just goes like, hey, I just did it. And we're like, what the heck is that guy doing? And I remember that I paid a lot of money to go check out these guys in Spain and have like a one-on-one consulting with them. And I get there, I spend 2 days with them. I look at their strategy and I go like, man, these guys are like they're caveman. Like their strategies are super simple. They're not sophisticated at all. Like our sales strategies, our marketing is way better in every single sense. And after actually testing out what they thought I just reached the conclusion that it was just a different market. Because Spanish people at that moment had money and they looked at the prices in dollars and went like, oh, it's dollars. When Latin American were like, oh, it's dollars, right?
Right.
So I wanted to ask you, how important do you think market selection and timing the market, not in investments, in entrepreneurship, how important do you think it is? How important has it been in your career?
I don't think it's been that, I guess, not that important. Like, for instance, Chris, when I started to raise capital in a big way, it was 2008, like when the crash happened. So we're targeting people that have mutual funds and they just lost 50% of their value of their portfolios. And out of good conscience, I couldn't say, hey, Chris, you should sell your remaining half. You just got your ass kicked and give it to me. I said, obviously you should wait because the market's going to come back. So, that was in one of the worst recessions ever. And we became one of the fastest growing companies in Canada for a number of years. So I think it's more about, your strategy and your execution. I think you can be successful anywhere, anytime with proper strategy and execution. Obviously, you have to have a compelling offer, a compelling product. Now, on the flip side, I'm not raising as much money as Mexico as I thought I would compared to Canada. So, obviously, I guess the Canadian market or U.S. marketplace I would raise more money. But on the flip side, the spread in Mexico is way, way better. And the cost of labor, lawyers, accountants is way, way lower. So at the end of the day, you can do a lot less in Mexico and still make more money than I did in Canada.
You carry less risk, right?
Less risk there too. Way less expenses. When I finished raising capital in Canada, we had 4 chartered accountants on staff and a lawyer. And, average, you're making about $17,000 a month each. What can you get in Mexico for $17,000 a month?
Yeah, no.
You can have a whole ton of accountants and lawyers, right? So, again, I maybe went in circles on that answer, but just kind of looking back as you asked me these questions and spontaneously, we started in one of the worst times and we did okay.
I love it. Yeah. And it's also funny because that crisis might have been for your offer maybe a great timing, the way you approached it. And there's always people that make the best out of crisis and they just grow. It's incredible. Now,
well, the other crisis was the apartment industry also crashed, right? So everything was half price. And Canadians knew the U.S. crashed and they knew it would bounce back. So that was, again, there's 2 sides to every coin.
One of the things I hear a lot in the U.S. right now is that there's a huge crisis when it comes to commercial real estate being empty. What do you think about it? Is there an opportunity there? Not really? Is it uncertain?
I would just agree with your point. I read an article a couple of months ago and sent it to Ken McElroy and Ross McAllister, some of my mentors when it comes to real estate. But again, people ask me a lot of times, okay, what real estate market should I invest in? Or, should I buy commercial? And really, people think I love real estate. I don't. I don't really care about real estate. I care about cash flow. And what I like to do is raise capital. But as far as real estate goes, I don't know too much. I've read the general highlights. And
you've got the mentors.
The office. But again, I just want to raise capital. Once I have it, then I'm going to make sure I place it with people that are professional. And office space is never something I've been involved in. So again, I've read a lot of the statistics. It looks like it's grim in the United States, really grim. But I'm not an expert. And
one of the things that I see in you and I see in other people that are really smart investors is just stick to what you know. Like, what would you tell us about that? Is it really true, or do you think more about diversifying, or just like focus on one niche and just like really get to know its in and outs?
Well, I'll tell you a quick story that's made me millions of dollars. I was at a seminar, and this goes back to financial education. And Robert Kiyosaki used to have about 2 seminars a year, and you could go for 3 days, and they were $5,000 each, $5,000 US. And I'd fly from Canada to the seminars. And eventually I became an advisor, but we still paid. We always had to still pay something. And he had this exercise, I don't want to give it away, but it was basically on focus. Because before this time period, I had an advertising company, I was flipping houses, I owned part of a restaurant, I had a sign company, I had all kinds of crap. And after this exercise at that event, immediately it became very clear the only thing I was going to do is focus on my seminar business. I was going to focus on one thing, not 5. And Chris, after that, again, we made Canada's fastest growing profit magazine list 3 years in a row. I sponsored the Olympic team back in the Vancouver Games for $1 million. We did okay. We bought 5,000 properties, all because I focused.
I love it. And I know that you've been focusing on that for a long time, and of course it's brought great results. But you're also involved with a coffee company, right?
I just sold it, actually, my portion of it. So just before I moved to Mexico to retire, I wasn't raising capital for a couple of years. And I invested in Warrior's Heart. And Warrior's Heart is a drug and alcohol rehab center in Texas, in Bandera, Texas. Josh and Lisa Lannon, who you know, they started it. So I was one of the larger investors way back when. So one of their partners was in the special forces of the United States military. And I don't know much about the military. Again, I'm Canadian as well. But I was tasting his coffee one day. It was really good. And the next day, the coffee wasn't very good. And I said, where's the good coffee? And they said, oh, Black Rifle, and it's growing really quickly and blah, blah, blah. Long story short, I met the owners and they said, hey, why don't you do it in Canada? So I did that for the last 7 years. But I literally just sold out 2 months ago when I came up to Canada. I sold my office building in Canada and I want to exit out of Canada.
Oh, incredible. Did you enjoy being involved in the coffee business for that time?
It was great. The people on my team were fantastic. It was a really interesting brand. So yeah, it was a good time and I got to drink a lot of good coffee.
Love it. Hey,
Yeah.
and I know that one of the things that you teach the most, or you share the most, is about this cash flow quadrant. Can you tell us a little bit about it and how does it work?
Well, Robert Kiyosaki wrote what many people say is his second best book after Rich Dad Poor Dad. Some might say it's his best. It's called The Cash Flow Quadrants. And if you can do a graphic, in this webinar, I'm not sure if you can, but you could always put up, the four letters. But on the left-hand side of this quadrant, there's the E and there's the S, and the E stands for employee. So Robert segregates these four letters and explains how each quadrant really thinks and how they do or do not really make very much money. So most of us are taught to, go to school, get good grades, go to university. Why? So you can get a good job. And if you get a job after university, then you would be in the employee quadrant. So it's the top left. And what most of us are taught by our parents is that's what you should do. And that's what I was taught, So eventually I went to university. I have a business degree. I struggled a lot with school. I barely got through university. I failed 1 year of high school, but eventually I became an employee. And I realized that if I was going to be rich, which I wanted to be when I was a very young boy, I couldn't do it on a $25,000 salary as a financial analyst. So that's why I quit that perfectly good job my dad kicked my butt for. Because I looked at my boss who was making 50 grand and he was 25 years older than me. And I thought, I'm never going to be rich. I want to be rich. Now, one of the reasons you're not going to be rich is you're taxed heavily in the E quadrant and you just don't make that much money. And then your job can be, you can be fired or laid off anytime. There's no security. So some people then become a small business, which is the small S underneath the E. And that's what I did. I said, okay, now I'm going to start my own business. I started a small business, made about the same amount of money, but I realized you're going to have a lot of tax benefits in the S quadrant. But I was stressed. So the S also stands for Superman. Okay, so you do everything. It really wasn't a business.
You're a one-man show.
That's it. You're a one-man show. So you're stressed. Now, my dentists, who became my partners when I was raising capital a few years later, they were in the S business. If they don't show up, Chris, if they don't work on somebody's teeth, they don't get paid. So my dentists were telling me after 30 years, their backs are worn out, they're tired of the business, they can't sell their business for very much, maybe $500 a patient or something. So they're not going to sell their business for $100 million. And most dentists and doctors have been taken advantage of because people think, they think they're so smart. So a lot of the S quadrant people are smart, but they're not smart financially. They're book smart, but they're not smart financially. And everybody knows this, but if you go to university, as I asked one veterinarian, they went to school for 7 years, not one course on business, and they got to open up their own clinic. So the E and the S are very difficult to create much wealth in those quadrants. The real money is the B and the I quadrants. And B stands for business. And Chris, I've seen you do it. And by the way, I got to give you a plug too, because you did win that competition, the Shark Tank. And it wasn't just me voting. The whole room voted that you should win.
Thank you, man. It was fun.
And you had a great presentation, great communication skills. And I was happy to lend you some money as we promised. And you paid it back with good return, so I'm happy. But the B business, so let me ask you now, you can do this part. So what's the difference between a B business and S business?
I would say systems, people, just automating things and making sure that your time is not stuck to your money-making process.
That's it. I mean, systems and team. Business is a team sport. So I could travel anywhere in the world and, we have systems that allow the money to continually be raised. So I've got a team that does it, takes care of things. And when you have larger businesses, the tax rates are significantly different than small businesses. So the tax code of almost every country, 90% of it is not what you would think. 90% of tax codes, and they're thousands of pages thick, 90% are showing entrepreneurs, business owners, how to get incented to either build apartments, drill for oil, maybe have solar panels, and 10% of the tax code is what you're going to be taxed on. So the B quadrant, when you sell your business, for instance, and I sold businesses in Canada, you might pay 20% tax because there's favorable tax concerns for you. Whereas if you're a dentist, you're paying 50 or 60% tax. So the B allows you to have systems and teams all over the place, and you pay actually less tax than the S. And then finally, my favorite is the I category. It stands for investments. But truly, the I category is people that raise capital. And it's the hardest quadrant. That's what Robert Kiyosaki says. It's the hardest quadrant. And what Robert's taught me over the years, as well as his mentor, one of his mentors, only lazy people use their own money. And when you have the skills necessary to raise capital, you can look at any deal and you can say, I could do that because I can raise capital. And the I quadrant has a tax rate of 0 for many, many, many years. For instance, if you buy real estate because of depreciation. So when I raised money for my investors, we bought real estate, you're not taxed for years and years and years. Whereas if you're an employee or a dentist, you're paying your tax before you even get your paycheck. So there's just some differences, but it's the way people think. The E and the S, not too many wealthy people, if any. And the B and the I, that's where the money is in the world.
I love it, man. Thank you for sharing. And I want to go back to like a very brief comment that you made at the beginning of this interview. And you said that we're talking about the I quadrant, being an investor. And you mentioned that you don't believe that higher returns necessarily mean higher risk. Why? Or how would you have to structure a deal so it doesn't mean like that? Because usually especially let's say in Latin America, there's always like shady investment opportunities that promise like really crazy things, and people have related higher returns to higher risk. Why don't you see it that way?
Well, I can give you a Mexican example, or I can give you a United States example. But the Mexican example, one of my partners' name is Oscar, and I invested my own personal money with him about 2015. I met him in Hermosillo. And Cris, in Mexico, you have a program where people can buy their first home, and the government kind of helps them with it. They have Infonavit. So you can buy a house, and Oscar, what he does is he buys rundown houses, entire neighborhoods actually. He'll buy 100 houses at a time and then renovate them and fix them. And there's almost an unlimited demand for these houses to be bought by people that have these Infonavit accounts. So he's done, I think, 9,000 of these houses. He's turned them over, 9,000 in, say, 10 years. And of course, when he first starts, there's going to be something he's never heard of before. There's going to be something that happened he's never heard of before. But after you do something 9,000 times, Cris, do you think you get better at it?
Yeah, of course.
Okay. So if you're going to invest in Oscar on the first house, I would say it's going to be a lot more risky than the 9,000th house. So as time goes by, the risk is going to go down with Oscar because he's done it 9,000 times. And because he's done it so many times, he can turn my money over because he can do these turns quicker because his team's better, he's experienced. So I actually get better returns. So my risk has gone down every year for 10 years and my returns keep going up. Okay. So again, it's just the way people think. To me, there's no correlation between just because it's a high return doesn't mean it's risky.
It depends on how the deal's structured and who is actually running the deal, I would say.
Well, it depends on their experience, So Ken McElroy, rich advisor, he's got me 15% returns, my investors, myself, for many, many years. He's never lost money for an investor. So same kind of story, but he's never lost money for an investor.
I love it. I love
decades.
It. And it goes down to your research and, again, investing into your network and who you know and just making sure that you're having that famous deal flow that we were talking about.
That's it. Experience.
Darren, so we're actually getting close to wrapping up our interview. And one of the things that I wanted to ask you is if somebody wanted to know more about what you do in Freedom Investment Club that we haven't talked about it right now, but where should they go visit you? Any social media account, any website?
Well, Freedom Investment Club of Mexico, freedominvestmentclub.com. And just last week, we did a deal with a business partner where we invested to buy a fintech in Mexico. Mm-hmm. So the new fintech that I'm now involved in is called pm2.com, in Spanish, pimidos.com, pm2.com. And you can see, some of the deals that we're involved in there. I'm really happy to be involved in fintech. Again, I said earlier, my weakness is technology. So to see what the world is doing when it comes to technology and investing and what Mexico's doing, it's pretty exciting. So that's kind of the new thing these days is pm2.com.
Love it. So we'll have all of the links right below this video, guys, so you can check it out. And that's pretty much it there. And anything else that you want to leave, like one last piece of advice for entrepreneurs, investors, anything?
Well, you're in good hands with Cris. And like I mentioned, I've known him for a number of years now, and he knows how to raise capital himself, but he also knows how to deploy it and get back returns. So I think you're in good hands. He's a great communicator. I call you for advice too. It's not always just, it wasn't always the other way too. I called you, you came to my house and, taught me about technology for a while too. So you're in good hands with Cris and his programs, and I'll always support you. If you ever need anything I can help you with, I'm always here for you.
Thank you so much, Darren. So guys, I hope that you really enjoyed this interview. Go check out Darren's website and his projects, and we'll see you on the next episode. Ciao, ciao.
Thanks.